All right, welcome, Bryan Price. Pleasure to have you here on the Olé Soccer podcast. We are excited to talk to you about your journey with Top Mental Game, your journey in the career to become a mental trainer, you could say, something that's happening more and more. But we want to talk about your expertise, talk about your journey, talk about obviously how you use it with your own daughter, right, and their teams, the programs you're creating for people, whether it's clubs, whether it's players, whether it's coaches, anybody that wants to learn a little bit more about what it takes to be a champion and the mindset you need to have in order to be able to become a champion in that way. Tools that you can use on and off the field are critical. I think this is something that our audience is going to get a lot of value from. We're going to dive into your history of your playing career. You were an athlete, your military career. When you spoke in front of, was it Congress? Was the government? Who did you speak in front of? So we'll talk a little bit about that, so really looking forward to this conversation. So Mr. Bryan Price, thank you again for joining us. So welcome, and let's get right into it. So, when did, how long ago did you start Top Mental Game?
Yeah, so it's interesting. First of all, thanks for having me, Walter. This is really cool. I'm really flattered that you guys would ask me to come on, even though I'm on the other coast, right? I'm in New Jersey on the East Coast. And also, happy Mother's Day, to everybody out there, and hope everyone's staying safe in the Olé Soccer family. So my background in terms of how I started Top Mental Game, it really started back when I was a Division I athlete playing baseball, unfortunately not soccer, at West Point. And so I was a baseball player there, and they had a place there called the Center for Enhanced Performance, which was very early on in the mid-1990s, a bunch of sports psychologists that worked on the mental game for Army's Division I athletes and teams. And so that's where I kind of really got exposed to this thing called mental skills training or mental performance training. And then I fell in love with it as a player, and then I went out into the Army. And for those of you that are familiar, when you go to West Point, you have to serve a military commitment. I thought I was going to be in for 5 years and then take off, but the joke was on me because I ended up staying for 20. Wow. And when I left West Point, I was commissioned as an aviation officer. So I flew the Apache Longbow helicopter, which is an attack helicopter. Had experiences dealing with pressure, obviously, as an officer in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And then the Army, I was very fortunate, sent me to Stanford University out in your coast.
Oh, yeah.
North of you, obviously, but nonetheless in California. And went to Stanford and got a PhD in political science. And then spent the second half of my Army career mostly teaching at West Point. But that also gave me an opportunity to coach on the baseball team there. So I had that experience both playing as a D1 player and then coaching at the D1 level as an assistant coach. But also I fell in love with the mental game there too. And by that time, things had progressed a lot. And so once I retired from the military in 2018, I moved to New Jersey, my home, about a couple blocks from the beach. So I can't beat it, although I don't want to hear any jokes about Jersey Shore coming from Olé Soccer folks.
No. Don't worry about that. You're good. We'll leave those for a different conversation.
But, it was something that I felt like no one was really doing in my area. And so one of the reasons why I decided to start Top Mental Game to provide this type of mental skills training to elite athletes in the area was I started I run a leadership institute at Seton Hall University, which is in the Big East. And I offered for free to work with a lot of their athletes, whoever wanted to work on it. And two teams kind of popped up. One was the women's golf team, which if you've ever seen me play golf before, you would have thought, what am I doing with them? But and the baseball team, which I kind of felt very at home with. And there was so much success that we achieved in both of those teams that it really it was the pushing point for me to start my own business. So I've been open for about a year and have been very fortunate to provide mental skills training to over 600 athletes at the D1 level, at the DA level in soccer, and even younger. And so that was kind of the impetus for it.
Wow, that's interesting because it's a different game. Even myself coming and playing at the club level to the high school level to when I played, there was no DA. So we played here in Southern California. It's called Co Soccer League, and then there was Premier, right, which was the highest division, I guess you could say. Now, if they were to compare it, I guess that would be the DA level, right? And then from there, you move on to play either college, pro, wherever you go, right, semi-pro. But transitioning from being a player to a coach, you see the game completely different, right? And you understand at times why a coach makes a certain decision. If you're watching a sport, you're trying to understand and be like, well, this is why he or she made that decision, or go back and rewatch it. How did the player react? So I think a lot of us right now are watching The Last Dance of Michael Jordan and watching Phil Jackson and watching how the players are reacting. So everything's like, wow. And one thing that I took from your story right here is that you went from becoming from a player to a coach, and that's, you totally flip the other side of what it comes to leading, and from being told what to do necessarily. All right, instructions, at times you didn't ask why, but how big was that of an impact for you into this journey of becoming a mental skills coach, just becoming an actual coach for baseball and golf?
Yeah. No, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of, it is kind of a paradigm shift from being a player where even though you have teammates and you care about your team, when it comes to the mental game, you're really kind of focused on yourself. Whereas when you transition to a coach, and I think my transition was a little easier also because I'm also a teacher, right? And so at the end of the day, coaching and teaching are pretty kind of simpatico when it comes to trying to reach kids and relate to kids. But what it was really kind of is of interest to me is, even when you and I grew up playing, and I imagine this is the case out in California, although definitely the case in the different places that I've lived throughout the country, where I think the physical improvements to youth sports is so much better than we played as kids. When I look at, I mentioned earlier, I have an 11-year-old daughter that plays competitive soccer, and I know you have two children as well. And so when I look at their opportunities, the turf fields they get to play on, or the beautifully manicured fields, they get to play underneath the lights, and the coaching, how fantastic is it for kids in Olé soccer to learn from someone like you? Whereas when we were around, it might've been somebody's dad that, you were lucky if they played high school soccer. And so, looking at all those improvements, I think they're fantastic. The facilities, the training. However, with those improvements on the physical side, I think has increased the amount of pressure on young athletes, particularly, to perform at higher and higher levels at younger and younger ages. And with that pressure, I think we haven't given our kids the requisite mental skills in order for them to deal with that pressure. And we see this, I imagine you see it with your club as well, but also, I see it all the time, not just in soccer, but in other youth sports where you have high levels of burnout. You have, dysfunctional parents on the sidelines, and, bad scenarios like that. And, this is one of the reasons why I decided to get into this, which is because I think there's a gap and there's a need in order to provide those mental skills to help our young athletes cope with the pressures that are now with youth sports. And those, as you well know, those pressures are here to stay.
Yeah, they're not going anywhere, anytime soon. And when we're talking about youth sports in general, I feel like a lot of the times we've seen that parents almost want to live through their kids, right? Have you noticed that as well?
100%. And look, I think, at the end of the day, we all want our children to have better opportunities than we had. But I also think that, I know for a fact that almost all the parents that are around today doesn't know what it's like to grow up and in the pressure-filled, cauldron that is youth sports. And that's one of the reasons why, in addition to, I work out with individual athletes, I work with teams at both, as young as 11, as old as Division I teams. But I've also been interested in working with parents of late too, because I think helping them see how they either help or hurt their kids' mental game is sometimes eye-opening. And this goes for parents that were athletes like you and I, but also parents that weren't athletes that might be new to competitive sports.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great point. I think it's a great opportunity. And one thing we were talking about before we started the actual interview was it comes down to just the education, the awareness of it. Because when you're not aware of something, how can you help yourself, or how can you help somebody else if you're really not at the conscious level, you could say, of realizing what's going on around you, right? And what's going on through your kid's head, and what's going on me as a parent. Should I even be saying this? You know, should I just be parent? Should I let coach take a step back? So it's very interesting.
So it's funny you say that because, I've been recently, I'm a new columnist for Soccer Today. I think it's where you might have seen some of the previous stuff. I interviewed Julie Foudy, and we can talk about that obviously. But my first article for them talked about, there's 4 pillars to U.S. soccer youth development. You have your technical, your tactical, your physical, and then the 4th pillar is the psychological component. And when you talk to a lot of athletes and coaches, they can tell you exactly what they're doing to improve technical, tactical, and their physical. And we've seen it even during the COVID crisis. But the one pillar which like no one really seems to know how to coach or teach is this psychological component. And it's funny because when, I interviewed Julie Foudy for one of my webinars, we can talk about those too. She talked about the critical importance of being mentally tough and how, oftentimes the fact that mental toughness and that psychological component was literally the determining factor between them losing the World Cup in, was it 1995 versus, which players were added to the team or not. And I think if parents kind of had an education and coaches as well, I think we can do a lot of cool things with, and I think a lot of athletes would surprise themselves as just a little bit of work on the mental game can improve their performance on the pitch.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I definitely want to get into that a little bit more. And one thing I think we should start off with, Bryan, is defining in your definition, what are mental skills? Like, what does that, when someone thinks of that, they can think of many things, but to you, what does it mean to have mental skills? What is that?
Yeah. It's funny because when one of my problems with Top Mental Game is kind of having to articulate what I do, right? Like some people are like, what do you, hypnosis, is it Jedi training? Like what do you really do here? And I think, I kind of try to simplify it. And I like this definition of mental toughness as a branching and a launching pad for talking about different mental skills. And so I define mental toughness as the knowledge, the skills, and the ability to perform at your best, regardless of the circumstances. And so, when you break that down, it's like, do you know how to be mentally tough? Do you have the actual skills in order to be mentally tough? And then you have the discipline, which is like oftentimes the toughest part. And when I talk about regardless of the circumstances, I mean regardless of the score, whether you're up 4 goals or down 4 goals, whether you are starting or coming off the bench as a reserve, whether there's 10,000 people in the stands and you're willing to take, that PK for, that goes in overtime, or whether there's nobody in the stands and you're just playing against, maybe what we might be used to coming up with the COVID response with no fans out there. Like, how do you perform at your best? And so we talk about mental skills. They include a number of different things. One is I usually work on with my athletes. The first thing I do is get to know them as individuals. And let's get very laser focused on goal setting. Like, I'm absolutely shocked at even the Division I level when you ask a player what are their goals, on how few they are able to articulate them. And it's not just, and there's a science and a sports psychology component to both setting your goals and helping you, set the right goals and how to achieve them.
Can you give an example, Bryan?
Yeah, 100%. So if you ask many athletes and even coaches or adults on this, and you say, talk about your goals for the next 6 months or even year, and let's stick with athletes for now, they will probably rattle off a bunch of what I call outcome goals. Like, I want to score this many goals, I want to be a starter on the team, I want to be all conference, or I want a Division I scholarship to, whatever, university of their choice. And I call those outcome goals because you can't really do much to influence whether or not that outcome is achieved or not. So let's take the D1, the Division I scholarship offer. Like, that player does not control playing time on his or her team. That's the coach's job, right? That player doesn't determine, which opponents that their league is going to play in and which scouts are going to be in the stands watching them play. They don't control the admissions committee of that university. They don't control who's divvying out scholarships. So none of those things are underneath your control. But if you ask a lot of athletes, they will come up with a lot of those outcome goals. I recommend, it's okay to have those outcome goals, as I call them, to steal a phrase from Jim Collins, the big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAG. And so, like, what is that goal that gets you up out of bed in the morning? And that very well might be a starting spot on your club team. That could be, a scholarship to a D1 school. But I really get laser focused with my athletes on the process, on how do you achieve that. And so what are those things I ask my athletes, if you had to come up with 3 or 4, I call them bucket areas. You can call them priority areas. Like, what are those 3 or 4 bucket areas that you control? And so the things that are in your control, I have another article coming out in Soccer Today, maybe today, called Control the Controllables. And so those are things like you control your diet. You control your rest and recovery plan. You control what are you doing, outside of practice in order to work on specific skills. And so when you ask an athlete, what are the things that you can control that are going to maximize your likelihood of achieving that, of your outcome goal, your BHAG, then you empower that athlete. And if that athlete focuses on you've probably heard before, fall in love with the process, right? Trust the process for those Philadelphia 76ers fans. Like, if you focus on your process, the outcomes are just going to take care of themselves. And here's the other kind of kicker, which is if you focus on your process and you're true to it, you're disciplined to it, and you don't achieve that outcome goal, you're going to be disappointed, but you're not going to be disappointed in yourself. You're not going to because you by default have done everything in your power in order to achieve that outcome goal. And so I think that also helps a lot of athletes from the identity issues that we see today in youth sports as well.
Yeah, no, that's great information. I think you're absolutely right, because when we're talking about anything in general, but specifically when we talk with coaches, even how many coaches before the season, during the season, are able to say, look, this is our team goal. And then how can we even set individual goals? Because you also need to, like you're saying, you got to know who you're dealing with, right? You got to know who can do what, and not necessarily realistic, but it's almost a sense of like, all right, well, I kind of know the level that this player is at, right? This girl or boy is at. And as a coach, you got to say, all right, well, this is what I need you to improve on. So these are your this activity that you're going to be able to control the controllables, right?
Yeah.
This is what I want you to control, right? You have no control over this other player nor the defender's activity, but whenever you confront a team like this, you're now going to have the skills. And when I ask you to do something, now I can hold you accountable, right, to be able to perform at that level, because you have been able to. And if you don't, then I know, and your team will know, right, that you have not been able to keep up with what we're asking you to do, right?
Yeah.
So
I think from a coaching perspective, it's interesting. There's a great phrase that, the biggest doors swing on the little hinges, right? And so if you focus as a coach as to, even if you say, I want to win X amount of games, well, then if you break down that into a process of like, what's going to achieve that? And then if you get really into the detailed process and say, what are the behaviors that we want to see in practice that are going to enable us to compete at the highest level in those big pressure moments? And that comes everything from, hustling on and off the field, getting those 50-50 balls. It's those little things that add up to really big things over time. But you also mentioned, so I just gave you goal setting as one example of the mental skills that we talk about. The other kind of interesting components is there are certain techniques where I can have my athletes improve their focus, to improve their self-talk. And then I think the ones that really my athletes gravitate towards is resilience. Like, how do you bounce back from adversity when it will inevitably strike when you play sports growing up? It's not, when you're going to fail, it's how quickly can you get back up, and get back on the horse. But the coolest part, I think, that a lot of athletes are really jazzed about is incorporating visualization and imagery techniques into their kind of routines. And my analogy, my example for this, and by the way, all these things that I'm telling you are things that elite level athletes are already doing. And, whether you're talking MLS or Premier League, like these are not foreign skills to players playing at those levels. nor is it for our special forces and SEALs in the military. But when it comes to my analogy for this is when your team shows up to the pitch to go play or practice, you guys, you'll have a stretching routine, right? Whether you stretch out as an individual or as a team, there is a routine that you go through in order to prepare your body for physical competition. And yet I'd ask, what is the routine that you put your team through in order to be mentally prepared and to quote unquote mentally stretch to compete at the highest level? That's another thing where if you ask a lot of coaches, I don't care if they're youth coaches or high school coaches or Division I coaches, man, that first 15 or 20 minutes of practice can sometimes be like a complete dumpster fire because we ask these kids to go from kids and, oftentimes being in class for 6 or 8 hours and then flip a switch to go from that into elite athlete. Well, we have them stretch their bodies, but can you come up with a routine to help them, mentally stretch so that they're prepared to compete at a high level?
Wow, that makes a lot of sense because even me growing up, it's like, well, my parents would say, well, you show up, you got to be ready. You show up, make sure you give your absolute best from the beginning, right? And then I took that even as a player with the coaches that I had, same thing. Like you show up, you always got to be ready. But we don't understand at times, the majority of us don't understand the process and what the kids, how much even pressure now kids have, what we're talking about, how to actually have some sort of mental training exercise or some exercise to allow the kids to focus, because we're talking about kids, and us here at Olé, we focus on youth, right? So kids, their brains and the way that they think completely different than adults, right?
Yep.
And so us as adults, we think that they think similar to adults, so they can just quote unquote snap out of it, right? But kids, they're different. So what type of warm up would you say, or what advice would you give to coaches that do have their players showing up, and what can they do to warm them up mentally to get them prepared for training?
Yeah. So this is one of the things that I love working on with I have my individual athletes do it, but I also recommend teams do it. And different programs call it different things. There is some call it priming, some call it mental huddles, like whatever it is. But let's just say at the start of every practice, and it doesn't have to be long. We're talking like 4 to 5 minutes tops. If you could get that team together, quiet, which is also sometimes an interesting drill, particularly with younger athletes, and you just had them go through, let's just talk about 4 or 5 deep breaths, and teaching folks. And what we're trying to do is to try to get the athlete to get present, meaning they're not worried about what happened at school today. They're not worried about the homework that they have tonight. They're not worried about the guy or the girl in the 5th grade class that they're interested in. They're worried about the pitch and what they have, like the task at hand. And so if you get them into, breathing is obviously a great way to do this. And I teach my clients and my athletes to breathe in through their nose for 6 seconds, pause at the top, and then exhale through the mouth for 6 seconds. And while you're doing that is to kind of to try to get laser focused, right? And other psychological techniques there is like to sometimes envision breathing in like positivity and like, whatever some athletes will kind of visualize breathing in white smoke and then exhaling all the stress, all the negativity, all the garbage from the day, and exhaling black smoke. So if you do that 4 or 5 times, then you transition into what are the 3 things as a coach that you'd want your players to visualize in that practice, right? And so like maybe one of those might be, our Olé soccer, in our club, we always get to that 50-50 ball. And inside their head, you give them something to visualize, and it's only for 30 seconds. Have them close their eyes and visualize, a ball that's a free ball that is between them and their competitor, and they're going after and getting that and winning that ball and visualizing that almost like a highlight reel. A second one might be, for your forwards and your attackers and your strikers, to say, every scoring opportunity I have, I finish. I put it in the back of the net. And maybe you visualize them hitting upper 90, and they go through their highlight reel to do that. Maybe your attackers, you envision themselves like, nobody gets in my defending third. And I finish every tackle, for your fullbacks and stuff. And so if you could just do those 3 things or whatever behaviors you want as a coach to kind of get people focused on, once you do that breathing exercise, once you have them visualize, those, I call them affirmations, those 3 things, man, you are ready. Everybody's on the same sheet of music. Everybody feels refreshed, recharged, and ready to know what to do. And you've literally probably saved the first 15 or 20 minutes of practice. It's going to be efficient now, and it's only cost you 4 minutes.
Wow. That makes so much sense, because even me as a coach, I need to even get into that zone at times, because there's so much going on. You're even thinking when your players get there, oh, I'm missing this player. Like, I have a session plan for 10 players, and right now we only have 6. Where's this player? Where's this player? And then by the time you know it, you're 5 minutes in, 6 minutes in. I think these type of exercises will encourage players to get there sooner, right? And obviously, the kids don't drive themselves, but you have to have a conversation with the parents to explain why I need them on time, even more than just the physical side, because they're going to improve that way, because it's going to allow them to focus. And because of that, they're going to be able to perform better on the field. And because of that, they're going to become better players, et cetera, on and off the field. So that makes a lot of sense.
The one thing I'll add to that, Walter, too, is just like your stretching routine is almost like a comfort to them. If you get into where you are doing that type of mental prep prior to a game, it almost will feel comfortable to them. And so whether they're playing for your club championship or at Super Copa, or, where if you do the same thing and it's a routine, you kind of remove the anxiety level for a lot of your athletes. And so I think it's such an easy thing to incorporate. It really is.
Do you think it's more along the lines of habits or lack of habits in general when it comes to performance? Because now we even see, I was reading something, I don't know if it was on your website or I came across it. Russell Westbrook has his own mental performance coach. I know the highest athletes, the U.S. women's national team, soccer team has their own or had their own. Now they're doing what I think I was reading on your article, Headspace, using Headspace, right? Yeah. And so what do you think about habits in creating those?
Yeah, when I work with both my teams and my individual athletes, what we'll do is I utilize a number of different visualization imagery exercises because we're all different. And so these visualization imagery exercises are injected to or designed to inject positivity. Like we all walk around by nature, our brains are kind of evolved to the point where we're always looking for threats. And we can, and most of our thoughts are actually negative throughout the day. They can be repetitive negative. So if you want to be average, like don't do anything with your mental game. But if you want to be elite and you want to be extraordinary, you might not be able to play like Messi or Ronaldo, but you can certainly learn how to think like them. And so part of that is incorporating these visualization imagery exercises into routine. And so, I have my athletes, there's some times during the day when your subconscious is more receptive to these things. Those 2 times are often the first thing when you wake up in the morning. You're in that kind of weird fuzzy fog between you're conscious, but you're not. I actually send my athletes guided visualizations on their phones so that they can put them in their, into their AirPods or whatever they're listening to. And so they have it. And then also at night is another great time. I also recommend my athletes do it in the shower, which, a lot of families have like Bluetooth speakers in their shower, listening to music or stuff. Why not take that 3-4 minutes and put a visualization in there? But then also I have my athletes do it, before competition. So when they're driving to an event or, they're in the locker room before an event, they can put this stuff in there and they get into a routine. And so, look, I run into a lot of people sometimes that are skeptical of this, and they're like, oh, this is just touchy-feely stuff. You just mentioned, like Russell Wilson spends 90 minutes a week doing this, meeting with his mental skills trainer. Every single Major League Baseball team, NFL team, MLS team, the U.S. Women's National Team, they all have – this is going to be – like people think it's weird now. My analogy for this is 30 years ago, if I would have told you that every Fortune 100 company in the country would have yoga and mindfulness and, sleep pods, for better productivity, you would have thought I was nuts.
No way. No way.
Now you're the weird one when you don't have it.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is going, we already see it at the Division I level in certain programs, definitely Pac-12. But also I think that you're going to see this being pushed down to lower levels. So high school, and then, competitive soccer clubs like yours and others. You're going to start seeing this a lot. But here's my question for everyone out there. If you are skeptical, is to ask yourself, what percentage between 0 and 100 do you think success in soccer depends on the mental game? And so, usually I get varied answers on this. It's interesting when I work with athletes, the older they are, the higher the percentage that they give to this. And so my average answer when I ask audiences this, and I probably asked this to over 600 people at this point, is usually around 70-75%. And my follow-up question then is, okay, well, how much have you worked on your mental game? And the answer is inevitably 0. The part is because people don't know how. So I'm excited about kind of bridging that gap, with both my business, and by no means am I unique. I'm unique in my Jersey Shore area, but I guarantee you in your neck of the woods out in California, there's folks that are doing this. I do recommend though that if you are a coach or you are a parent and you feel as though your child, even if they're not struggling, if you want them to get that extra edge, to look out for folks like us. And the beautiful part about mental skills training is, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Walter, it's not just for sports and soccer. It will help you in every aspect of your life. For those of you that have kids that are really nervous and experience test-taking anxiety, or they get nervous when they have to do public speaking, or when they have to go in for that internship or that job interview, or even asking, Sally or John out to the prom. Like, we all deal with pressure situations. And, I try to teach techniques that help people perform at their best when the pressure's on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that makes a ton of sense. And everything you're saying, from the individuals to the teams to the CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, you no longer want to start doing mental. You need it, and more importantly, you need it because sports are, obviously a tool for life, right? It teaches a lot of invaluables and intangible things that even me as an athlete growing up, I look back, I'm like, wow, that was a memorable experience. I remember doing that in soccer. Now I'm trying to translate that into life, right? But more importantly, I feel like this is a tool that can be taught through sports, right? But more importantly, as they graduate from, let's say, playing soccer and whatever they do as they become adults, they're going to remember, and they're going to have these habits we're talking about here with Bryan. They're going to have these habits that are going to allow them to be better human beings, right? Better soccer players, better CEOs, better entrepreneurs, better teammates, better teachers, or wherever they go, right? And we're hoping that when they leave our soccer community and when they leave wherever they're going, they're going to take all these tools, they're going to take these values, these habits, and they're going to carry them on. And hopefully, in their friendships, if they become parents, they choose to pass that down. So I feel like this is something more, I think it's bigger than just sports, right? And that's the way that is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on, because this is more than just sports, right? Because as you know, right now, there are a lot of things going on right now we can't control. Right? How can we refocus, and how can we get kids to focus, and parents, coaches, communities, clubs to understand that, like, there's something bigger going on right here that we need to be able to kind of try to learn about and channel our inner best, right? Our absolute best at home. So it carries on when we get back to it. Like, let's go.
I couldn't agree more. I think the umbrella concept that puts everything underneath it is, in life, we all have to deal with pressure and adversity. It is inevitable. And so there are proven techniques and tips on how to deal with that pressure and adversity so that you are more mentally tough in order to, overcome those obstacles when they are inevitably presented in front of you. And that doesn't, whether you're in business or in school or with your relationships, it is 100%, it transcends, it is definitely outside of sports. I just happen to love it just because, growing up as an athlete, as a coach, and as you well know, as a coach yourself, like, sports is such a great vehicle for teaching life's greatest lessons. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. One thing that I want to get back to what you're saying is the self-talk aspect of mental training, because as we're growing up as players and we see it as coaches, you see kids kind of like at times doubting themselves, whether it's a penalty in a big game, which my team recently, they got to they were in the semis to make it to the final, right? And we're there and we tie the game, we go straight into PKs, right? And we had practice penalties, but in my head it's like, they're ready, right? They're ready, but it really got to them, right? So the self-talk aspect, and before when we were doing PKs, I would tell them like, well, you got to believe that, you got to already visualize that you're going to make it. You have a certain corner and everybody has their tricks, but you got to be able to, it starts with you, right? That self-talk. So how important is self-talk to players, and especially youth players nowadays?
Yeah, it's, I say, talk to any coach or parent or player, and you say like communication is so important, particularly out on the pitch with your teammates and your coaches, but there's nobody that we communicate more with than ourselves. And that conversation is occurring, a lot. So there's been a recent study that occurred about 15 years ago that said that they came up with the average number of thoughts that we have as humans in a 24-hour period ranges anywhere between about 60,000 on the conservative end to 120,000. And up to 80% of those thoughts can be negative. And up to 95% of those 80% can be repetitive. So that is a lot of repetitive, negative things going through your head. And again, as we mentioned earlier, it's for an evolutionary purpose to keep you safe, to keep you alive. But that's also a recipe for keeping you average. And so, when people are skeptical of this, I say, think about the one or two plays in your career where you completely screwed up. And usually you can come up with those pretty quickly. And now if I said, give me the same two plays where you achieved, you were awesome on this play. And oftentimes you have to kind of struggle to kind of come up with those things. But boy, you can come up with those two plays that where you really had a big error on the pitch, and maybe you lost it for your team. Maybe it was a missed PK, whatever it is. The same thing happens with our self-talk. And so one of the interesting, and feel free for coaches to steal this one. I love this technique. When I do these online webinars and when I'm with teams, I'll have individuals, I'll say, write down on a piece of paper the two most horrible, wretched things that you say to yourself in competition, like over and over again. Whether that's like, you always let the team down in big moments, or, if you're right-footed, your left foot really stinks. I can't shoot with my left foot. Like whatever those, those really negative things that you consistently say to yourself. And I have them write it down on a piece of paper. And when I'm working with a team, they all think that they're going to just, have it on their piece of paper and then maybe even tell me. But I say, no, turn to your teammate and read off what you have on your paper, but say it to your teammate, not as though you're saying it. So if I wrote down on my piece of paper, I always let my team down in big moments. You need to turn to your teammate and say, you always let your team down in big moments. And oftentimes when you do that, the player, I ask them, how did it feel? And they said, well, it kind of felt weird telling my teammate like they sucked, or, like whatever horrible thing that they say. And I say, that's exactly what I'm trying to go for. Like, if it was difficult for you to tell your teammate that stuff, how many times are you telling this to yourself over and over again? And it all comes down to this, Walter, which is I say, okay, if that's what's happening to you 1,000 times or 100,000 times during the course of your career, do you think that's helping your play or hurting your play? And the answer is easy. We play better, at least this is my contention, we play better when we are loose, focused, and confident. And we play at our worst when we are tentative, negative, and, all full of anxiety. And so if that self-talk, if you are not aware of your self-talk, get aware of it. And if you are aware of it, change it so that, at least you're not being negative. I don't think you have to walk around being lollipops and unicorns and rainbows, but remove that negative self-talk. And so I teach my athletes, come up with 2 or 3 affirmations of positive things that they can constantly say to themselves so that they're looking forward, as opposed to,
Yeah.
focus on the negative.
That makes a lot of sense because I was talking to a few of my players and even talking to them about having you on and learning and so I asked them how many of you are afraid to take penalties, right? And they I know who they are, and then they kind of like raise their hand. I was like, why do you think that is? It's like, then I started talking about self-talk briefly, and so. And say, yeah. And then sure enough, what they said is that, yeah, it's because we're telling ourselves like, yeah, I'm telling myself that I'm not good at PKs. I'm not good at crossing the ball with my left if I'm right footed or vice versa, right? I'm not good at shooting from outside the box, right? And things like that. So I said, we're going to be able to change that around, I told them, right? So we got to be able to have that self-talk, right? That proper self-talk that we want, this is what we want to see and this is what's going to happen. So I absolutely see that. And it's still, I think to this day as adults, we do that all the time. Like, because of many, many reasons, the crowd we hang around with, the people obviously that we were surrounded with, even family, but one thing I did read recently was, raising your standards, right? I was watching a Tony Robbins video, and then he said, you know what, if you start raising your standards, everything else will start to change, right? And that's including your mental standards, right? Yep. So it's absolutely huge, and it's amazing. So talking about now advice to parents, what have you seen more and more on parents, like something that's come up, like a certain situation or quote unquote problem that they have that you're seeing more and more that you're helping people out with when it comes to the parent side of this?
Yeah, on the parent side of it, I think the root of it is, are you helping or hurting your kid in their performance? And if you talk to the kids separately, and here's the interesting thing is, I work with athletes both at an individual level and team, as I mentioned. And one of the things I have them take an intake form all the time about where does pressure come from? And what I'm really trying to get them at is to tell me, are they putting it on themselves? Is it coming from their coach, or is it coming from their parents? And I'm seeing it, first off, interesting, the number one answer is themselves, which is them, the player putting it on themselves. So parents should know that from the outset, their kids are putting a lot of pressure on themselves. But the second most popular one is not the coach, it's the parents. And so when you kind of look at it from an objective perspective and say, are you helping or hurting your child? I think we all want to help our children when it comes to that. And so far, the first step is kind of self-realization or self-awareness that you're probably hurting your kid as opposed to helping them. Secondly, this question always comes up, and, I don't know if anyone has cornered the market on a great answer, but like, what is the car ride home conversation and what should it be like? And if, the one overarching thing that should come across for kids is that their parents love them and their parents are proud of them. And there's a time and place for talking about the X's and O's of what went on. And I struggle this with myself, being a former athlete myself. I see things on the pitch that, my daughter doesn't see. And because the coach has to worry about 11 kids, he may or may not be watching my particular child that play. So I think I can help. But it's got to come from a place of love and where the kid feels that unconditional love to perform. Because sooner or later, those parents aren't going to be on the sidelines anymore, and that child is going to have to fend for themselves. So this is like another push for, well, then let's give our kids those mental skills needed to deal with this pressure. And here's the thing, is to deal with the pressure that also comes from the parents.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're starting to see that more and more, and parents are really, I think, for the most part, everybody has good intentions, right? And they want their kids to absolutely just be their best. And parents nowadays are investing so much on now private trainers to group training to camps to clinics, and it's really become something where I really want my kid to advance. And we also got to understand, that part where the parents are really putting in a lot. So they put pressure on them because they are doing so much and they're taking them everywhere and they're quote unquote sacrifice. Some may not see it as sacrifice, but they're doing a lot for their kid, right? But I could see how that can really put that pressure on the kid. Now, you're saying the car ride home, or even the car ride to practice, picking them up for practice, but it does really come down to the kid being out there enjoying it, especially at the young age, going to love for it. But like you're saying, building these habits so that they know how to actually approach the practice and get the absolute best, because we can't control the outcome every single time. There's no way, right? But you can control the controllables, right?
Yeah, I think you just hit on something that kind of this goes back to those physical improvements that I mentioned earlier. And I think a lot of parents, when they don't see their children having the results that they want on the pitch, the gut reaction is that they need to double down on the one-on-one training and the physical and the tactical and all those, like the foot skills that's out there. And those are all fantastic. But it's interesting. I would say your money's better spent on a couple sessions with a mental skills coach to give those kids and I'm biased in this regard, right? And I run a business that does that. So I just want to here's my bias. I am presenting it in front of you. But I will tell you that, like, just from my stance, parents would benefit from a couple sessions with a mindset coach or a mental skills coach than spending another 6 months of foot skills with their individual. Because oftentimes what the parents will often say, and I bet you this resonates with a lot of folks in your club, which is, Johnny or Sally, I see them in my backyard and they can do all of these things. They're amazing with their foot skills. But then when they translate it into a game or they're in a pressure situation, things go haywire. And they think the answer to that is, well, they must need more technical skills. Yeah. And I'm not poo-pooing the technical skills. Like, those trainers are worth their weight in gold. But I would ask you, if you're not getting those same results, and if they're having difficulty transition from practice to games, the mental component might be an area where you would see a large return on investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so necessary, because it's something that I don't think is really investigated or even trained on, because you said it before, because we don't know how.
Yeah.
Right. The majority of people don't know how, unless you were actually trained or you do your own research or we connect you with Bryan Price. You're not going to really know how. So I really feel like the soccer community, the sports and coaches to players to parents, this is something that's going to allow the game, especially at this youth level, to be able to really develop and stay, right? Because it's going to be that mindset. And to be honest, Bryan, one of the reasons why we have our club is because one day we want to produce world-class players, right? That compete against, doesn't matter, whether it's Brazilians, whether it is Dutch players, Chinese players, Australian players. But one thing you see that they have in both genders is a certain mindset, right? That one player you just see laser focused, but does not take any crap. And all of them are like that, at the highest level. You can see it. They're all completely focused, right? And we see a lot of players come up that are so talented, right? And at times the most talented ones are not the ones that make it to the highest levels, that become those pros. It's the mentally tough ones, the ones that have a certain drive about them and that just put in the work, right? So
I'll give you a kind of a non-soccer example. So, one of the things that I show in my webinars is like a picture of Tom Brady. If you've ever seen his draft picture when he was, he's rocking the complete like dad bod in that picture. And so, like, I tell folks, I could go find 10,000 quarterbacks in this country that might be more physically talented, bigger, faster, stronger than Tom Brady, but you're not going to find too many that are. And I'm not a Tom Brady. I'm not a Buccaneers fan or a Patriots fan, but Giants fan. But like, you got to respect the mental toughness of this. And you hit the nail on the head, which is when you look at elite, whether you're talking Premier League or the U.S. Women's National Team, you're talking about players that are really mentally tough. It's very rarely are you seeing players that come up with awesome talent, but they don't have the mental game. You have, I just wrote an article for Soccer Today on Control the Controllables. And, in it, I talked about Messi, like if Messi was worried about how big and fast and strong he was when he was, suffering from his growth hormone disorder as a kid and having injections and always being the smallest kid on the pitch, he would have given up soccer. But he didn't. He controlled the things that he could control: his skill, his talent, his attitude. And I think that there's lots of lessons to kind of be learned from that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we can go on for days just having this conversation, right? It's definitely fun, but I want to be able to share, where people can connect with you, Bryan. From players to parents now to coaches. I think you're doing boot camps on a weekly basis. You do one-on-ones with players. So how can people learn a little bit more about your services and what you have to offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can just go to topmentalgame.com. That's kind of my website, my home base. You can connect with me on Facebook and Twitter. I'm also Top Mental Game, and LinkedIn. My Instagram is my first and last name, Bryan Price 7, and thank you for sending that out to your community. So what I'm doing right now is in this kind of COVID response, I've really dabbled in providing 3 and 5 day boot camps for athletes. And I've done them all sports, and I've also done them specific for soccer because I'm starting to grow this kind of community. And I think that, as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of space in soccer right now, particularly in youth soccer, where there's a need for these mental skills. And so if you're interested in some of those, and also, if there are parents and folks out there, I'm willing to do something specific for clubs and teams. The cool part is that since I've started this about a month and a half ago, I've literally had athletes all the way from Hawaii, many in California, Texas, Washington, Nevada, all the way through the East Coast up where I am in New Jersey. So it's been really fun connecting with a lot of different athletes. On top of that, I also work with individual teams and athletes. I do one-on-one coaching. One-on-one coaching is pretty cool. I just got off I have a golfer in Texas that I'm working with right now. I've had soccer players in California and Nevada. And one of the cool things I use with my individual coaching is heart rate variability training. And so you kind of connect it to your earlobe. And what I will do is I will show the athlete how their body and their biometric feedback changes based off of the visualization and the imagery exercises that I give them. And that's been kind of mind-blowing for athletes. And once we figure out like what exercises really work and click for you, man, I put it to your phone, and now you can carry it around whenever you want. So I offer 3-month and 6-month packages there. And I also tailor things for teams. And so what I'm interested in, I think where I'm going to be moving kind of forward is in the soccer community. And you hit the nail on the head earlier. I don't think a lot of coaches or clubs have this capability right now. And I'm interested in growing that for them. And so I think I'm going to be working a lot more with clubs and teams, although I love working with individuals too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's excellent, because at the end of the day, the goal is to raise the sport, right? The goal is to raise the sport, and more importantly, raise good human beings that are going to be obviously doing something good with their life and anything they choose, whether it's soccer. And we don't know what's going to happen. It could be an injury that prevents them from continuing playing, but how can they take those skills and just have a better life, really? And obviously there's a big void, and I think it's going to be fun, and I'm looking forward to reading the new article about Soccer Today. But we really appreciate you coming on and your time with us. And I think the audience today, whether it's players, coaches, parents that are watching, I really feel like they received a ton of value just from this conversation and obviously the interview. And I really hope that people, definitely reach out, follow Bryan Price, Bryan with the Y, Bryan Price 7 on Instagram, and then topmentalgame.com to learn more. Definitely think that our club is going to continue to work with you. I have a few ideas that I want to bring you on, so it's going to be fun. So lastly, what I want to end with, Bryan, is a book or two that you recommend for our audience.
Yeah, I got them here. 2 books. One is called Switch, which has a lot of really kind of cool things on how to change things when change is hard. That's one. And then one I'm almost ending right now. It's on Legacy, on the All Blacks on the rugby team out in New Zealand. And if you're a coach and you want to talk about culture and those sorts of things, definitely recommend both of those. The last one is by James Kirk.
Got it. Switch and Legacy. Would definitely recommend those. Got to check those out as well. Well, Bryan, thank you again for coming on, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully we can do this again, and continue to stay in touch.
Likewise, Walter, and I wish all of your club stay safe and healthy out there.
Thank you. All right. We'll talk soon. Thank you.
All right. Cheers.